My name is Sarah Reeves, and I am 34 years old. For 4 months, I watched my in-laws move through the house I had spent 6 years saving to buy as though they had always lived there and I was the one visiting. They rearranged my kitchen. They repainted the guest room without asking. They invited their friends over for Sunday dinners in my dining room and introduced themselves to the neighbors as the homeowners. And when members of their extended family asked about me about where I fit into the picture of this house they were now presenting as theirs, my mother-in-law, Patricia, looked at them with the confident smile of a woman who has already sorted everything out, and said that I had no say anymore, that family had taken over, and that things were going to be run properly from here on. I did not argue with any of this. I did not confront Patricia or her husband Gerald. I dare not tell my husband David what I was planning, because David was caught between his parents and his wife in the particular paralysis of a man who loves both and cannot see a way through that does not require choosing one. I did not call a family meeting. I did not send emails or draft ultimatums or do any of the things that the situation might have appeared to call for. I called my lawyer instead, and I waited. The moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in November, 6 weeks after I had made the call. My lawyer's assistant, a composed and efficient woman named Ellen who wore the same sensible blazer every time I had met her, knocked on the front door of my house, the one with my name on the deed, the one purchased with money I had saved before David and I were married, the one his parents had spent 4 months treating as their own, and when Patricia opened the door, Ellen handed her a sealed envelope and said,
Mrs. Reeves, Sr., I'm here on behalf of Harrison Legal. This is formal documentation of sole property ownership for 14 Maple Creek Drive, along with a notice of terms for your continued residency. Ms. Reeves, Sarah Reeves, has requested that you read this today.
Patricia took the envelope the way you take something when you do not yet understand what it is. Ellen thanked her and left. Patricia stood at the door of my house with the envelope in her hands, and she turned around and looked at Gerald. And then she looked at me and she said,
What is this? What does this mean?
She said it with the slightly elevated voice of a woman who expected the question to resolve itself before it finished being asked, because questions in Patricia's world generally did resolve themselves in her favor if she asked them with enough confidence. Gerald appeared at her shoulder, and he looked at the envelope and then at me, and he said,
Is this some kind of joke? Who sent this?
He said it with the impatience of a man who had not been made to wait for answers in a very long time. I sat at my kitchen table, where I had been drinking coffee when Ellen knocked, and I looked at both of them standing in my foyer holding the envelope, and I said,
You should open it. It explains everything clearly.
I said it without heat. Patricia opened the envelope with the sharp, controlled movements of a woman whose composure was operational but under pressure. She pulled out the document's 4 pages, printed on firm legal paper, with the Harrison Legal letterhead at the top, and she read the first paragraph. Then she read it again. Then she looked up at me with an expression I had never seen on her face in 6 years of knowing her, and she said,
This says you own this house. This says your name is the only name on the deed. This says David has no ownership claim, and neither do we.
She said it slowly, the way people read a sentence when the sentence cannot possibly mean what it appears to mean, and they are waiting for the meaning to shift. I looked at her and I said,
That's correct. It's all in the documentation.
The foyer was very quiet for a moment. Then Gerald sat down on the bench by the door, the bench I had chosen at a furniture market 3 years ago, the one Patricia had moved twice in the past 4 months to positions she found more aesthetically appropriate, and he put his hands on his knees and stared at the floor. Before I tell you how we got to that afternoon, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story genuinely means something to you. Drop your city and local time in the comments below. I love knowing where you are watching from, and I read every single comment. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to the house and how I came to own it, to the marriage that brought his parents into my life, and to the 4 months that made a Tuesday afternoon in November necessary. The house on Maple Creek Drive was mine before David ever saw it. I had been saving for a down payment since I was 24, in the methodical and slightly obsessive way of someone who has grown up in rental apartments and developed a very specific idea of what security feels like, which is a place with your name on it, that you can paint any color you want, that nobody can tell you to leave. I had a separate account, a spreadsheet, a target number that I revised every 6 months as the market moved. When I was 27, my grandmother died and left me a modest inheritance that she had specified in her will was for something permanent, something that would last. She had written that specifically something that will last in the old-fashioned cursive that covered everything she had ever written to me. I combined her inheritance with everything I had saved, and I bought the house on Maple Creek Drive. 3 bedrooms, a kitchen with good light, a backyard with an old oak tree that had been there longer than the neighborhood. I closed on it on a Wednesday in March, alone, and I drove home to it afterward and sat in the empty living room with a cup of coffee I had brought from a drive-through because the kitchen had no furniture yet, and I felt something that I understood had something to do with my grandmother's word. Permanent. I met David 8 months after I moved in. He was a friend of a friend, easy to talk to, with a laugh I liked, before I liked much else about him. We dated for 2 years and married in the backyard under the oak tree, and I was happy in the simple, grounded way that comes from knowing what you are starting from. I had been clear with David, from early in the relationship, that the house was mine. Not because I was anticipating problems I was not, and the conversation had been easy, but because I had inherited from my grandmother not only the money for the down payment, but her particular way of thinking about things, which included the belief that clarity in advance prevents confusion later. David had agreed. It was not a contentious point. He respected that I had bought it before him and that it was in my name, and we moved forward from that understanding as a settled thing. What I had not fully accounted for was his parents. My lawyer, when I eventually called her, would tell me that I had structured everything correctly from the beginning, and that the problems I was dealing with were not legal problems, but human ones, and that human ones were harder to document and slower to resolve. She was right on both counts. Patricia and Gerald Reeves were people who had strong ideas about how things should be organized, and who had learned over the course of their marriage and their parenting that their ideas about organization tended to prevail if they were applied consistently and without apparent doubt. They were not cruel people. They were not, by most measures, unreasonable people. They were people who had built a life that worked according to their specifications, and who had spent long enough inside that working life that they had begun to mistake their specifications for something closer to natural law. From the time David and I married, they had opinions about the house. The opinions were delivered in the warm, helpful tone that made them easy to receive as gifts even when they landed like instructions. The kitchen layout was not optimal. The guest bedroom would benefit from different lighting. The backyard oak tree, which I loved specifically and which was the reason I had chosen the house as well as the venue for our wedding, was positioned in a way that would eventually cause foundation concerns and perhaps should be evaluated for removal. I received all of these opinions with the polite appreciation of a person who has decided that not every hill is worth climbing and that a functional relationship with one's in-laws is worth a certain amount of quiet nodding. I nodded. I continued to organize the kitchen the way I had organized it and light the guest bedroom, as I had lit it and loved the oak tree specifically. Then David's company relocated its regional office. The relocation was to a city 3 hours away, which meant David needed to commute on an extended basis or travel for weeks at a time while we figured out the long-term plan. David was working through options when Patricia called me on a Thursday morning while David was at the relocated office for his first full week, and she said,
Gerald and I have been talking, and we think the most sensible thing is for us to come and stay with you while David is away. You shouldn't be alone in that house. And honestly, we've been thinking about downsizing anyway, so this could work out for everyone.
She said it as though the thinking had been thorough and the conclusion was logical, and the only remaining step was the agreeing, which she expected to follow. Naturally, from the quality of the reasoning, I asked how long she was thinking, and she said,
Oh, we'll see how it goes. There's no reason to put a timeline on family.
She said it warmly, as though the absence of a timeline on family. She said it warmly, as though the absence of a timeline was a feature rather than a flag. I said I would need to talk to David. She said, of course, talk to David, though her voice said she had already talked to David and that part was handled. I talked to David. David said his parents were just worried about me being alone. that it would only be temporary, that it would mean a lot to them, and that he had told them it was probably fine. I said it was my house and I needed to be the one to decide. He agreed it was my house. He also said his parents were already packing, which told me the decision had already been made in the place where decisions were made in the Reeves family, and that my participation in it was being offered as a courtesy. I let them come because I was choosing my battles and because I told myself that temporary could be honored even when it was not defined, and because I believed at that point that the situation would remain manageable if I remained clear about what the house was and who owned it. I was wrong about the manageable part. They arrived with a van. I'd expected suitcases. What came out of the van was furniture. Not all of their furniture, but enough. A large armchair that Gerald was apparently not willing to leave behind. A decorative mirror that Patricia had decided would be better in my front hallway than the piece that was already there. 3 boxes of kitchen items, which arrived with the explanation that Patricia had better equipment than mine and that having proper tools in a kitchen made everything easier. My equipment was not poor. I had chosen my kitchen items over years, with the deliberateness of someone who cooked regularly and valued having specific things. Patricia's better equipment replaced specific items of mine on the counter and in the cabinets, which required reorganizing the cabinets, which Patricia did on the second day while I was at work, so that when I came home in the evening, I stood in my own kitchen looking for the olive oil in the place. It had lived for 3 years and found it in a different place where Patricia had decided it made more organizational sense. I moved the olive oil back. Patricia moved it again the next day. This exchange, trivial in itself, was the first of many small territorial conversations conducted entirely in the language of objects being put in and removed from specific locations. The guest room became their room, which had been the plan. What had not been the plan was that they would remove the photographs I had hung in there, 2 prints I had chosen specifically, ones that made the room feel like a part of the house rather than a generic space, and replace them with family photographs from their previous home, the Reeves family, documented over decades, looking at me from my guest room walls. I said nothing. I was choosing my battles. But I was also beginning to understand that the battles I was not choosing were accumulating into a territory being claimed by people who did not own the territory, being claimed by people who did not own the territory. My friend Nadia came for dinner 2 weeks after their arrival and found me quieter than usual, and she asked about it directly, the way Nadia asked things plainly, without softening the asking. I told her what was happening, and she listened, and at the end she said,
Sarah, you own that house. You own it. They can't actually do any of this without your permission. Does Patricia know that? Does she understand that legally she is a guest?
She said it not to alarm me, but to anchor me in a fact she could see I had lost some contact with. I told her Patricia understood that David and I owned the house, and Nadia said,
No. Does she understand that you own it? Not David. You.
She said it with a precision that landed differently than the general statement had, and I sat with it and I understood that the answer to her precise question was no. Sol 3. The moment things shifted from an uncomfortable arrangement into something that required a formal response happened at a family dinner in the 6th week of their stay. David had come home for a long weekend, and Patricia had organized a dinner in my dining room with food she had prepared using my dishes and my table and my glasses for Gerald's sister and her husband, 2 cousins I had met a handful of times, and David's uncle from out of town. I had helped with the dinner because helping felt more constructive than not helping, and because I was still at this point managing the situation through the strategy of maintaining goodwill. Gerald's sister asked, at some point in the middle of the meal, about the house, whether we had made many changes since we moved in, how we found the neighborhood. She directed the question generally, to the table, the way people direct questions at family dinners when they are not sure of the dynamics. Patricia answered. She talked about the neighborhood with the authority of someone who had lived there for years, about the kitchen reorganization as an improvement, about plans she and Gerald had for the backyard in the spring. She talked about all of it in the first-person plural of a homeowner. We are thinking of doing this. We have found that the layout works better this way, and nowhere in her answer was there any indication that the house belonged to a different person than the one speaking. David's uncle leaned toward me and said something quietly. He was a perceptive man and had noticed something in the dynamic, and he said,
You must be glad to have family around to help with a house this size.
He said it kindly, offering me a thread of inclusion in a conversation that had been taking place about my home without me. I opened my mouth to say something, and Patricia answered before I could, she said.
Oh, Sarah doesn't need to worry about the house anymore. We're taking care of things now. It's better this way. She can focus on her work, and we handle the property.
She said it with the warmth of someone describing a good arrangement, an efficient division of labor, something that had been thoughtfully decided. David's uncle looked at me. I looked at my plate. David was talking to one of the cousins and had not heard. That sentence, "she doesn't need to worry about the house anymore," was the sentence that made me call my lawyer the following Monday morning. I want to tell you about the call because it mattered in the way that the right conversation at the right time matters, not because it produced anything immediately, but because it produced the clarity that everything after it was built on. My lawyer's name was Janet Harrison, and I had used her for the original house purchase and for the drafting of various documents since then. She was a precise, low-drama woman who communicated in facts and gave opinions only when asked for them and only about things she was qualified to have opinions on, which made her very good at her job. I told her everything: the arrival, the furniture, the kitchen reorganization, the repainting, the family dinner, the sentence about not needing to worry about the house anymore. I told her that my in-laws appeared to have concluded that the house was a family property and that my individual ownership of it was either irrelevant or something they intended to address. Janet listened to all of it and then said,
Sarah, your position is very clear. The deed is in your name, your husband has no ownership claim, and your in-laws have even less. What you're describing is a situation where people are behaving as though they have rights they don't have. The question is how you want to address that, and what you want the outcome to be.
She said it with the calm of a person for whom this was a solvable category of problem, and the calm was itself useful, because I had not been calm about the situation for several weeks and needed to borrow someone else's before I could think clearly. I asked her what my options were. She said,
Your options range from a direct conversation using the legal documentation as a basis, to a formal notice of the terms of their residency, to beginning a process that would require them to vacate. What I'd recommend is starting with the formal notice. It establishes the legal reality clearly, gives them the information they apparently don't have, and gives everyone a chance to respond to facts rather than impressions.
She said it practically, as though describing a sequence of steps, and I sat with it and understood that she was right, and that what I had been doing managing the situation through patience and goodwill and the hope that things would resolve was not the same as addressing it. I asked her to prepare the documentation. She said she would have it ready within the week. That was the call that made the Tuesday afternoon possible. So let me pause here for a moment, because I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where something that was clearly, legally, documentably yours was being treated as though your ownership of it was a formality rather than a fact? Where people moved through your life with an ease that revealed they had not counted you as a real variable in their planning? Drop that in the comments. I read every single one, and this particular experience is more common than any of us talk about. If this story is reaching somewhere real in you, please hit that like button and subscribe. Because what happened when Ellen knocked on my door and handed Patricia that envelope is something that changed the direction of everything. The 6 weeks between the call to Janet and the Tuesday afternoon delivery were the most deliberately patient 6 weeks of my life. I had told David about the call. This was a conversation I had prepared for carefully because David was not the enemy in this situation. David was a man who loved his parents and had been raised inside their particular gravity and had, by the time I married him, developed a set of accommodations to that gravity that were so deeply habitual he did not always recognize them as accommodations. He was not a weak person. He was a person whose family had a specific kind of pull and who had not yet been placed in a situation that required him to understand what that pull had cost the people standing beside him. I told him what was happening from my perspective, not what Patricia had said about me at the family dinner. Not yet, but the broader picture, the reorganizing, the repainting, the sense I had that his parents had begun to understand the house as something that belonged to all of them, in a way that did not align with who actually owned it. David listened with the careful attention of a man who is hearing something that requires him to reconsider a situation he had categorized as manageable. He said he would talk to them. I said I appreciated that, and I also told him I had called Janet and asked her to prepare documentation. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said,
Papers, Sarah? Is it that serious? Can't we just have a conversation first?
he said it not defensively, but with the genuine hope that the simpler path would be sufficient, which was David's instinct in most situations and which I loved. About him in the situations where the simpler path actually was sufficient, I looked at him and I said,
The conversation should have happened before they arrived with furniture and repainted the guest room. The papers are for after conversations haven't worked, and I think we're past the point where they haven't happened. We're at the point where they've happened and produced no change.
he did not fully agree in the moment, but he stopped arguing for the simpler path, which I understood as a form of trust. He talked to his parents that weekend. Whatever he said did not produce visible change in their behavior, which told me that the conversation had been heard as David asking nicely, rather than as a message with real content. In those 6 weeks, I continued living in my house as normally as I could manage. I went to work. I came home. I made dinner in my reorganized kitchen using the layout Patricia preferred because changing it back had become a daily conflict I had chosen to set down while I waited for the documentation. I sat in my living room with Patricia's curtains, which had replaced mine in the 4th week, and I watched television and talked to David on the phone and said nothing about what was coming. The only person who knew the full picture was Nadia. She came for dinner on the Thursday before the Tuesday, and she looked around the living room at the curtains and the repositioned furniture and the family photographs visible through the open guest room door, and she said,
How are you doing in here?
She said it quietly. Just to me, while Patricia was in the kitchen making tea she had not been asked to make. I said I was doing well, that things were nearly resolved, that I would tell her everything when it was over. She nodded and said nothing else about it, which was Nadia's particular gift, knowing when more words would not improve anything. The Tuesday morning before Ellen came, I woke up at 6:15, not because of an alarm, just the particular alertness of a body that knows something is going to happen today and has organized itself accordingly. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table in the early light of a November morning in the house I had saved for 6 years to own, and I thought about my grandmother. I thought about her word permanent, and about what she had meant by it, and about whether this house, which I had bought with her inheritance, and which had been rearranged around me for 4 months, qualified. I decided that it did, not because the rearranging had not happened, but because the rearranging had been temporary, which was a different thing, and which was about to become clear. Patricia came downstairs at 7:30 and moved through the kitchen with the confidence she always moved through the kitchen, taking a coffee cup from the cabinet where she had relocated the coffee cups in week 1, opening the refrigerator for the creamer she had added to the shelf she had designated in week 2. She operated in the space the way a person operates in their own space, without the 100 small adjustments that a guest makes because a guest is aware that the space belongs to someone else. She looked at me at the table and said,
You're up early? Are you working from home today?
She said it pleasantly, with the pleasantness of the last 4 months, and I said I was home for the morning and would go in after lunch. She nodded and made her coffee and went back upstairs, and I sat at the kitchen table and waited. Ellen knocked at 4:15. Patricia answered because Patricia had been answering my door for 4 months and had not questioned whether that was her role to fill. I heard the exchange from the kitchen, Ellen's voice, professional and clear, the name Ms. Reeves Sr., the reference to Harrison Legal. Then Patricia calling for Gerald, the sound of him coming downstairs, and then the 4 of them at my front door, and then the door closing. I heard Patricia reading the first page, then a long silence, then her voice, higher than usual, saying my name. I went to the foyer. Standing in that foyer with the legal documents in her hands, Patricia was a different version of herself than the one who had been operating in my house for 4 months. The confident, organized, quietly commanding woman who had introduced herself to my neighbors as the homeowner was visibly reassembling, trying to find the footing she was used to having. Gerald sat on my bench. He was looking at his hands. He had the air of a man who had followed his wife's organizational lead for most of his adult life and was now sitting in the unfamiliar position of an outcome she had not anticipated. I looked at both of them for a moment. Then I said, simply, that the house was mine, that it had always been mine, that the documents in Patricia's hands confirmed what had been true since before David and I married, which was that my name was the only name on the deed, that I had purchased the property with my own money and my grandmother's inheritance, and that no actions taken by any member of the Reeves family had changed that. Patricia looked at the papers and then at me, and she said,
Does David know about this? Did David know this whole time that the house was only in your name?
She said it with the particular emphasis of someone who is still in your name. She said it with the particular emphasis of someone who is still in the process of determining who knew what and when, whether there was a version of events in which she had been deceived by her son, rather than simply wrong in her assumptions. I told her David had always known, that we had been clear about it from the beginning of our relationship, and that the documentation in front of her simply formalized what had never been in question for us. She sat down. She sat on the bench beside Gerald, and the two of them were quiet together in my foyer for a moment that had a texture to it. The specific texture of people who have organized themselves around an understanding that has just revealed itself to be incorrect, and who are inside the moment of that revelation before they have found the language for it. Then Gerald said,
We owe you an apology, Sarah. I can see that now. I am not sure we understood what we were doing, but that doesn't mean we weren't doing it.
He said it slowly, with the effort of a man to whom direct apology did not come naturally, but who is making the effort, because the situation had arrived at a place where the effort was the only honest response. It was more than I had expected from Gerald, who expressed himself primarily through action and whose apologies were usually implied rather than spoken. Patricia was still looking at the documents, but something in her face had changed from the defensiveness of the first few minutes into something more ruminative. She looked up and she said,
I thought I was helping. I want you to know I genuinely thought I was helping. I thought the house needed what I knew how to give it, and I didn't stop to ask whether it needed it from me.
She said it with the honesty that sometimes arrives when all the available defenses have been understood as irrelevant. The sentence was true. It was also an explanation of a pattern that went beyond the 4 months and into the years of our relationship, the years of the kitchen opinions and the oak tree concerns and the steady management of a world she intended to make better, and had not always consulted about whether the making was welcome. I said what was true and necessary, I said.
I believe you. And I need us to talk about what happens next. Not today, because today is a lot already, but soon. All of us, including David, because this conversation needs to include everyone.
We were still in the foyer, the documents still in Patricia's hands, and nobody moved for a moment, and the house was very quiet around us. David came home that weekend. I had called him the Tuesday evening after Ellen's visit and told him what had happened, and he had been quiet on the phone in the way he was quiet when he was carrying something large and was trying to understand its dimensions before he responded to it. He drove home Friday and arrived in the evening, and the four of us, David and I, Patricia and Gerald, had the conversation I had told Patricia was necessary. It was a long conversation, 2 hours at my kitchen table, in the kitchen that had been reorganized twice and which I had left in Patricia's version because the kitchen was not the point. David said things to his parents that he had not said before. He said them carefully and with love because that was how David said things, but he said them clearly. He said that he should have been clearer earlier about what the house was and what that meant. He said that when his parents had crossed into territory that was not theirs to cross, he had not said so plainly enough, and that his not saying so had made the situation possible in a way that he understood was partly his responsibility. Patricia received this with the complicated expression of a mother receiving honest criticism from an adult child who loves her and is being fair about it, which is a particular kind of difficult that does not have a comfortable face. Gerald listened in the way he listened when he knew something true was being said and was waiting for it to finish. Then David said,
Mom, Dad, Sarah's house is Sarah's house. That was true before I met her, and it's true now. And it needs to be something we all understand the same way. What happens here, any decisions about this house, run through Sarah. Not through the family, not through me. Through Sarah.
He said it with a directness I had not fully heard from him in the 4 months of the situation, and it landed differently because it came from him, because Patricia and Gerald had organized their relationship with the house partly around their son, partly around the assumption that his presence made the house a Reeves family space, and hearing David himself describe the actual terms of the arrangement interrupted that organizing. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said,
I think we should move out. Properly. I think that's what the situation is asking for. And I think we should do it in a way that makes it clear it's our choice and not something we're being pushed into.
She said it with the dignity of a woman who had made mistakes, and had arrived at the conclusion that the graceful response to mistakes is to correct them without requiring the person you have made them against to do the correcting for you. It was, I thought, the best version of Patricia I had seen, the version that existed underneath the managing and the organizing and the confident certainty about how things should be done, a woman who, when she understood what she had done, wanted to undo it cleanly. They moved out the following weekend, 2 trips in Gerald's truck. They took the armchair and the mirror and the kitchen equipment and the family photographs from the guest room walls. They repainted the guest room back. Patricia spent a full Saturday on it, meticulously, with a roller and a brush for the trim, in the original color she had covered over, and when she was done she came and found me in the kitchen and said, without prompting, that the room was restored, and that she was sorry she had changed it. I thanked her. I meant it. The apology was the thing that mattered, not the paint. My kitchen is the way I want it. The olive oil is where I keep the olive oil. The photographs I chose are in the guest room. The curtains in the living room are mine again. But the more important changes are the ones in the relationships. David and I talked more deeply in the weeks after the situation resolved than we had in years, about what it meant to him to be from a family that organized itself around his parents' vision and what that had cost me without his fully seeing the cost. Those conversations were not comfortable. They were the conversations a marriage needs to have when it has been tested and wants to understand what the test revealed. Patricia and I meet for coffee once a month now. This was her suggestion, made 3 weeks after they moved out, offered without expectation of acceptance. I accepted because I believe she meant it, and the meetings have been what she seemed to intend, an investment in understanding each other at a depth that the previous dynamic had not allowed. At the most recent coffee, she said something that I have thought about since. She said,
I spent a long time thinking I knew how to make things better for the people around me, and I am only recently understanding that knowing how to make something better and having permission to make it better are 2 different things.
She said it looking at her coffee cup rather than at me, in the way she said things when she was being genuinely honest rather than making a point. I sat across from her and thought about all the ways that sentence was true and all the ways it applied to more than the situation we had just been through. And I told her it was a good thing to understand, and she nodded and said she thought so too. Gerald sent me a card for my birthday last month. He had not done this in the 6 years I had known him. Birthday acknowledgments had always been coordinated through Patricia, who produced them reliably and pleasantly. This was from Gerald specifically, in his handwriting, which was the blocky, practical handwriting of a man who did not write much and applied himself seriously to the writing he did do. He wrote that he hoped I had a good year. He wrote that the house was lucky to have someone who took care of it the way I did. Then, in the last line, in handwriting that was slightly less even than the rest, like it had been written after a pause, he wrote that he was sorry for his part in it. I kept the card. I put it on the shelf in the guest room, below the 2 prints I had chosen for that room, in the house with my name on the deed, in the place that was mine. I want to say something to you before we finish, because I think some of you watching this have a version of this story in your own life, maybe smaller, maybe different in the details, but recognizable in the shape. If you have something that is yours, a house, a decision, a life you have built, and the people around you have begun to move through it with an ease that does not account for your ownership of it, I want to tell you something I learned in those 4 months. Documents matter. Clarity matters. The law exists to describe realities that people sometimes refuse to accept through conversation alone, and there is nothing adversarial about using it for that purpose. I did not call my lawyer because I wanted to fight my in-laws. I called her because I needed the reality of the situation to be stated in a language they could not argue with, and that is what she gave me. But I also want to say that the documents were not the point. The documents were the mechanism. The point was the conversation that came after, in my kitchen, at my table, with all four of us speaking honestly about what had happened and what needed to change. The documents made that conversation possible by making the reality undeniable. The conversation is what actually produced the change. You are allowed to state the reality of what you own and what you do not. You are allowed to require the people in your life to operate within that reality, and you are allowed to use every legitimate tool available to you to make that reality clear, including the ones in legal envelopes delivered by professionals in sensible blazers on Tuesday afternoons. The house is mine. It was always mine. And now everyone in my family knows it, and the knowing has made something possible that the not knowing had prevented a more honest set of relationships, built on terms that are true rather than assumed. That is worth the 4 months. It is worth the envelope. It is worth all of it. Thank you for being here through this whole story. If it reached something real in you, please like and subscribe and drop a comment below telling me about a moment when you had to make a reality clear to someone who had been ignoring it. I read every single comment. Until next time, what is yours is yours. Make sure the people in your life know it. CI. I want to go back to those 4 months more specifically because I have told you the shape of what happened without telling you enough of the texture of it, and the texture is where the story actually lived. The kitchen reorganization was the first thing, but it was far from the only thing. The reorganization of a shared domestic space happens in layers, and each layer builds on the one before it, and by the time you step back and look at what is accumulated, the layers are no longer individual incidents, but a total transformation of the environment that is hard to reverse without addressing all of it at once. The second layer, after the kitchen, was the schedule of the house. Patricia had a particular relationship to time and routine that I can only describe as architectural. She built her days according to a structure that felt, from the inside of it, as solid and necessary as load-bearing walls. Meals happened at specific times. Cleaning happened on specific days in a specific sequence. The television in the living room was appropriate for the hours before 11 in the morning and after 5 in the evening, and the hours in between were for productive activity. I am not a person without structure. I have my own routines, my own preferred times for things. But my routines were built for one person living alone and then for 2 people learning to share a space, and they had the flexibility of something that had been developed organically rather than prescribed in advance. Patricia's routines were prescribed. And prescribed routines, when they arrive in an already occupied space, do not ask what is there and work around it. They simply arrive and assume the space will reorganize to accommodate them. Breakfast was at 7:30. I was accustomed to eating when I was hungry, which on weekdays was usually closer to 8:15 after I had made coffee and checked my phone and done the slow waking up that suited my rhythm. Now there was a 7:30 breakfast, prepared and waiting, and the implicit weight of a woman who had prepared it watching the clock and then watching the stairs. I ate at 7:30. I reorganized my mornings. I did it without complaint because there were larger things I was waiting to address and because Patricia's 7:30 breakfasts were genuinely good and because I told myself that adapting was a reasonable thing to do when you are sharing space with people. But I was adapting to their house. That was what was happening. I was adapting to the version of my house that they had built inside my house, and I was doing it so consistently that there were weeks when I had to consciously remind myself what the rhythms of my own life had felt like before they arrived. My colleague Diane noticed. She said it at lunch one afternoon in the 7th week of their stay. She said,
You've seemed different lately, like you're managing something the whole time. Are you okay?
She said it with the directness of someone who had known me long enough to identify a performance of okayness when she saw it. I told her about the situation, more specifically than I had told most people, and when I finished, she looked at me across the table and said,
Why are you protecting them from the consequences of what they're doing?
She said it simply, not as a criticism, but as a genuine question, and it was the right question to ask, and I did not have a satisfying answer to it. I told her about waiting for the right moment. She told me that the right moment was a thing people invoked when they were afraid of the actual moment. She was right. And I knew she was right, and it was part of what pushed me toward the phone call with Janet the following week. There was a Sunday dinner in the 9th week that I want to tell you about, because it was the Sunday dinner, the one that made Patricia's sentence about me not needing to worry about the house anymore possible, and the context of that dinner mattered. Gerald had called his brother Richard the week before, and Richard and his wife Donna had been invited for Sunday dinner. This was the invitation that was issued from my house to my dining room for a meal Patricia was planning to cook in my kitchen. And it was issued without any consultation with me beyond a notification delivered on Thursday that Richard and Donna would be coming Sunday and that Patricia would need to know if I had any dietary restrictions. She asked me about my dietary restrictions in my own house. For a dinner I had not been asked about, I said I had no restrictions. I said it pleasantly. I then had a quiet, private conversation with the part of myself that was keeping inventory, added this to the inventory, and continued with my week. The dinner itself was warm and social in the way of a family gathering, where the gathering is between people who are comfortable with each other and have a lot of shared history to work with. Richard and Donna were pleasant and welcoming to me in the way of people who had been given a context for my presence, the context of David's wife, present in the family home, which was a context that contained everything except the actual nature of my relationship to the space. Richard said something about the house that evening, a compliment about the backyard, and Gerald responded with the easy ownership of a man describing a property he managed, and I sat at my dining room table and let the conversation continue around me the way water continues around a stone. It was after dinner, when Richard and Donna had gone and we were clearing the table, that David's uncle in town, he had come separately. And I am sorry I did not mention this earlier, asked me privately in the kitchen whether I was all right. He was a perceptive man, as I mentioned, and he had watched the evening with the eyes of someone who was not inside the dynamic and could therefore see its shape. He said,
Sarah, I don't know the full situation here, but I know my sister-in-law, and I want to make sure someone is asking how you're doing in all of this.
He said it quietly, with the genuine concern of a man who had observed enough to understand there was something being observed. I thanked him and said I was handling it. He nodded and said,
If you ever need anything, a conversation, a neutral party, anything, I want you to know you can call me.
He said it with a sincerity that I found unexpectedly moving, partly because he was the only member of David's family who had directed that quality of concern toward me, and partly because being seen by one person in a situation where you have been largely unseen is disproportionately significant. I thanked him properly. I thought about that offer several times in the weeks that followed. The question of David during those 4 months is one I want to address directly, because it is easy for a story like this to make a husband into either a villain or a helpless bystander, and David was neither. David was a man in a genuinely difficult position who handled it imperfectly, which is the thing most people do with genuinely difficult positions, and I think telling you what his imperfection looked like is fairer than either excusing it or condemning it. He came home for long weekends during those 4 months, which meant he was present for a combined total of approximately 3 weeks out of the 4 months his parents lived in our house. In those 3 weeks, he lived inside the situation as a native rather than as a visitor. He moved through his parents' version of the house with the ease of someone for whom his parents' version of a home had always been the home, because it had been for his entire childhood. He sat at the 7:30 breakfast table without noticing it was at 7:30. He let his mother bring him things without noticing that the bringing was organized around an authority she had assumed. He also, in those 3 weeks, had 2 conversations with his parents about the house that I asked him to have, and both conversations produced the same result: acknowledgement in the moment, followed by no material change in the pattern. This was not because David was spineless. It was because the conversations he was having did not convey the full weight of what they needed to convey. And I believe they did not convey the full weight because David had not yet fully felt the weight himself. A man who is home for the weekend, sleeping in his own bed, eating his mother's good food, coming home to a house that is warm and organized and running smoothly, that man is not the same man as the woman who has been inside that house every day for 4 months, watching her kitchen reorganized and her guest room repainted and her routines replaced. The experience is not equivalent. The understanding that comes from it is not equivalent. I told David this. on a Sunday night toward the end of the third month, after he had come home for a weekend and told me the situation seemed manageable and that his parents were just trying to help. I told him plainly and without heat. I said,
David, you are here for 2 days at a time. I am here every day. The manageable situation you're seeing is not the same situation I am living in, and I need you to understand that before you tell me it seems manageable.
He was quiet. After I said it, the quiet of a man receiving accurate information he had not been organizing himself to receive. Then he said,
Tell me what you need from me, specifically. What do you actually need me to do?
He said it with the focused attention of someone who has understood that he has been offering the wrong kind of help and is asking for instruction on the right kind. I told him that I needed him to understand the house was mine, that his parents were there at my invitation and my patience, and that when I told him something needed to change, I needed him to act as though he understood the ownership structure and not as though it was a family negotiation in which everyone had equal standing. That conversation changed something between us. Not immediately change in real relationships is not immediate, but in the direction it needed to go. After they moved out, the house required some restoration. Not extensive. Patricia had been careful in the physical sense, whatever else had happened, but specific. The guest room was the most significant, and Patricia had already addressed it with the repainting. But there were smaller things. The cabinet arrangement in the kitchen returned to the configuration I had lived with for 3 years. The throw blanket repositioned on the couch. The photograph of me and my grandmother, the one taken 3 months before she died, the one I had chosen specifically for the shelf in the hallway, returned to the exact position it had occupied before Patricia had moved it to a location she felt had better visual flow. I did the returning slowly, over a week, not because it was technically difficult, but because I wanted to do it with the attention it deserved, not as a performance of reclaiming, but as an actual reclaiming, done quietly and thoughtfully, the way I had done everything involving that house since I first sat in it with a drive-through coffee cup and felt what permanent felt like. Nadia came over the Saturday after they left, and I cooked dinner for the two of us in my kitchen at the time I chose and with the organization I preferred. And she looked around the restored space and she said,
It feels like your house again.
She said it simply, as an observation, and it was the truest thing anyone said to me in the weeks around the resolution. It did feel like my house again. It felt like the house I had saved for 6 years to buy and had lived in with the specific satisfaction of a place that is yours in every sense, legally, practically, emotionally. I told her what my grandmother had written in her will, the word permanent. Nadia thought about it, and then she said,
I think your grandmother knew that permanent wasn't just about ownership. She knew it was about what you'd have to do to keep it yours.
She said it looking at the kitchen. At the cabinet I had reorganized back to my original configuration, at the olive oil in its correct location. I thought about whether she was right and concluded that she probably was, in the way of things that were not planned, but that turned out to have been necessary. The 4 months and the envelope and the Tuesday afternoon had all been part of keeping the house mine in every sense. The word contained. My grandmother would have approved of the envelope. She was a practical woman, and she understood that clarity delivered through proper channels was a form of respect. Not a hostile act, but an honest one. An insistence that everyone in a situation operate according to what was true. I like to think she would have been proud of how I handled it. The patience and the waiting and the documentation and the conversation that followed. The fact that I had not allowed the situation to make me smaller than it tried to make me, but had also not allowed it to make me angrier than was useful. She had given me something permanent and I had kept it. There is one more thing I want to tell you, because I think it completes the picture in a way the rest of the story doesn't quite reach. 6 months after they moved out, Patricia asked if she could come and spend a weekend. Just her. Not Gerald. She was specific about that. She wanted to come and spend time with me, she said, without it being a family occasion, without an agenda. I agreed, because I had agreed to the monthly coffees and they had been real, and I trusted that this was also real. She came on a Friday evening. I cooked, which I offered because it was my house and I was the host, and that was the natural order of things, in a way it had not been when they had lived there. She sat at my kitchen table while I cooked. and she watched me move through the kitchen. My kitchen, organized the way I organized it, with the olive oil where I kept the olive oil, and she was quiet in a way that was not uncomfortable, but that was clearly thoughtful. At some point during dinner, she said something that I have thought about since. She said,
I came here 6 months ago thinking I understood what you needed and what this house needed. And I came here tonight understanding that I had no idea about either. And I think the distance between those two versions of myself is something I'm still measuring.
She said it without expecting a particular response, as a genuine statement of where she was, rather than a request for comfort or absolution. I looked at her across the table, in the house I had bought with my grandmother's inheritance and my own 6 years of saving, and I felt something that I want to describe accurately. I felt something like gratitude for Patricia saying it, not because it resolved everything the 4 months had happened. The sentence about me not needing to worry about the house anymore had been said to a table full of David's family. The guest room had been repainted, the kitchen reorganized. Those things were real and their costs were real. But the person across the table from me was someone who had done those things and had arrived, through a process I had been part of but had not controlled, at a genuine understanding of what they were. And genuine understanding is the only thing that produces genuine change. And genuine change was what I had been working toward. We stayed at the table talking for 3 hours. Not about the 4 months, not primarily, but about everything around the 4 months. Our families, the things we had each been shaped by, the specific ways that caring about people and understanding what they need are not the same skill and do not always arrive in the same person at the same time. Patricia told me about her own mother-in-law, a woman who had moved in with Patricia and Gerald early in their marriage, and who had organized their home according to her own preferences, and who Patricia had found difficult. She said it with the self-awareness of someone who had just understood something significant, she said.
I became the thing I resented. I thought I was doing it differently because I had reasons, because the reasons were good. But the person on the other side of it doesn't experience your reasons. They experience what you do.
She said it quietly, to her coffee cup, in the way she said the truest things. And I thought about my grandmother again, about what she had known that she put in a will instead of a conversation, about the particular wisdom of people who understand that some things cannot be said in advance and must be arranged so that they speak for themselves later. The house spoke for itself, the deed spoke for itself, the envelope spoke for itself. And now, 8 months later, the conversations were speaking for themselves too. Slower, less documentable, requiring more maintenance than a legal filing, but real in a way that nothing was real until the people inside it had been honest, and the people inside it had been honest because the envelope had made the alternative impossible. That is how it actually works. Not cleanly, not all at once, but in the direction of something true. The house is mine, the relationships are healing. The olive oil is where I keep the olive oil. That is enough.